The University of Calgary, located in the heart of southern Alberta, both acknowledges and pays tribute to the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 7, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Simpson Center for Food and Agricultural Policy webinar, Federal and Provincial Responsibilities in Canadian Agriculture. Today's topic is focused on the responsibilities of both the federal and provincial governments in the agriculture sector. Our panelists today are going to discuss the roles and mandates of key government bodies such as Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and the Ministry of Agriculture and Irrigation in Alberta. Before I introduce today's panelists, a couple of quick housekeeping items for you. If you're having difficulties hearing the webinar at any time today, or you're experiencing an unreliable internet signal, you can always use the call-in number included in your webinar registration email, or by clicking the arrow next to the microphone icon and pressing switch to phone audio. There's a box labeled Q&A. This is where you're going to pose your questions to the panelists. If you see a question in the Q&A box that you think is important to ask, you can also click on the thumbs up icon on the question to move to the front of the queue. And the structure of today's webinar is going to consist of two presentations. And at the end of each presentation, we're going to have a poll question and an opportunity for you to ask some questions. Feel free to submit your questions at any time during the presentation, but please note, they're not going to be posed to the panelists until the very end of the webinar. Please join me in welcoming our wonderful presenters today. Dr. Grace Skogstad is a professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto Scarborough and the University of Toronto as well. She's a distinguished fellow of Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. Please join me in also welcoming our other panelist, Connie Phillips, the Executive Director of the Alberta Beekeepers Commission. And before we get started today, we do have a poll question for the audience. We'll pop that up now. So our question for you is, what order of government do you consider to be the primary leader in agriculture? Is it 1, the federal government, or 2, the provincial government? And we'll give you about a minute to answer that question. All right, get your final votes in before we close the poll. It'll be coming to a close here right away. And our results are 43% of you said the federal government and 57% of you said the provincial government. I now have the pleasure of handing it over to Dr. Skogstad, who's going to be discussing her research. Take it away.
Thank you, Sean. I want to begin by thanking the Simpson Center at the University of Calgary School of Public Policy for the invitation to speak to you today. I've lived in Ontario for the past 40 years, but I grew up on a farm outside of Barrhead, and until this year, I owned farmland in the Barrhead County. And I chat, pretty regularly, weekly with my Alberta family about developments, including with respect to agriculture in the province. But today is a rare and nice opportunity for me to talk with others who also share my interest in federal-provincial territorial relations and agriculture. So in preparation for this webinar, we were offered 9 speaking points. Given time limits, it's not going to be possible to cover them all in my opening presentation, but I will be happy to tackle those that I don't cover later in the Q&A. My comments are organized around the following speaking points. First of all, I'm going to discuss the division of responsibilities for agriculture as it's laid out in Canada's Constitution and has been, taken up by the federal and provincial governments. And I'm going to highlight there the capacity and incentives of governments to act independently. But I'm also going to, secondly, provide examples of successful FPT collaboration highlighting the multi-year agricultural policy frameworks that have been signed and implemented over the past 20 years. And then third, I'm going to turn to some of the challenges facing the agricultural sector in Canada, including the challenge of climate change, and discuss FPT actions there to promote a sustainable Canadian agriculture. And then fourth and finally, I will very briefly discuss the situation facing Canadian supply management, including the responsibilities of the two orders of government there, and how the sector is adjusting to liberalizing international trade agreements. So my overall message, the takeaway, if you will, is that there is a solid foundation for collaborative FPT relations around agriculture in Canada, and that the current challenges facing the industry are best dealt with by the two orders of government working collaboratively and with the agri-food sector. Could we go to the second slide, please? The next slide. Okay, here we are. No, just back one, sorry. Thank you. Okay. Now, I just want to emphasize here that, which you all know this, that the Canadian Constitution has established shared jurisdiction in agriculture, which means that both orders of government can act independently. And I think the thing about agriculture as well, and looking at Canada, is that, there is a lot of capacity here for independent policy making, except of course, subject to fiscal constraints. But besides the shared jurisdiction for agriculture, we know there are other provisions of the Constitution that provide legal authority for governments to act in the agri-food sector. Just a few of those. In Section 91, the Government of Canada has authority to enact laws for the peace, order, and good government of Canada. It has a considerable spending power to spend on matters that even those that fall within provincial jurisdiction. It has authority over international and interprovincial trade and commerce, and of course, it has the criminal law power, and all of those can impact upon agriculture in some ways. The provinces and the territories, also have considerable powers, not only with respect to agriculture, but in other areas in Section 92. They are able to control trade within their borders, and that empowers them to establish marketing boards and regulate marketing within the province. They can regulate a lot of the land use management and planning, and they also have control over natural resources in their jurisdiction, including water and soil. Now, this capacity to act independently also comes with incentives for independent action, because different governments clearly have different policy and political priorities. So we have a lot of incentives for independent action. So the next slide, please. Notwithstanding that, I think it's very important to understand as well that there are incentives that governments have to act together. And we see this in Canada. The incentives for collaboration, again, some of these arise out of the constitutional situation, in the sense that sometimes it's necessary to pool regulatory authority to overcome jurisdictional gaps. And the big example here, of course, is national supply management, where provinces can regulate the sale of goods within their borders, but they can't restrict entry of agricultural products from another province. And it's only the Government of Canada that can do that, and also regulate interprovincial trade. So the solution here under supply management is for the federal and provincial governments to pool their authority, and the federal government delegates its interprovincial marketing powers to provincial marketing boards. And another example I would use of pooling regulatory authority is, this is a de facto one really, and it occurs in international trade agreements where, again, the Government of Canada is the only government that can negotiate and sign international treaties, but it can't enforce provisions of them that fall within provincial jurisdiction. And so in this case, the smart thing, and the thing that Ottawa does, is to consult with the provinces and get them on board before it signs any international trade agreement that includes provisions that would fall within provincial legal authority, because Government of Canada is ultimately responsible for living up to those agreements. There are clearly as well incentives to pool fiscal resources, and that's to avoid the kind of policy incoherence and inequity in the treatment of Canadian producers that can result and have resulted in the past from governments acting independently. And the case here would be, for example, if wealthier provinces bring in farm support programs that poorer provinces can't afford, and that would put their farmers on an unlevel playing field. So there are these incentives to act collaboratively, and I think we see plenty of them. And the first example I'm going to go to is the cost shared agricultural policy framework agreements. So next slide, please. Okay, now I'm sure most people in the room are familiar with these multi-year agreements, whose larger share of the cost is picked up by the government of Canada in the 60-40 cost sharing ratio. They've been operating for about 20 years now, and they've survived, I think this is important to note, survived transitions from liberal to conservative governments, both majority and minority. And I've just listed them there. You can read them for yourself. I don't need to go through them. So next slide, please. So I start this with a quote from the government of Alberta, because I think it's important. Sometimes we hear a lot about conflict between federal and provincial governments, and including between the government of Alberta and the government of Canada. So I think it's really important. I just want to drive this home that the government of Alberta has described FPT relations around the framework agreements as in the following terms. For more than 15 years, the FPT governments have used agricultural policy frameworks to ensure a collaborative approach to the development of policies and programs that support sustainable growth and the long-term success of the agriculture, agri-food, and agri-based product sector. And again, I think that most people in the room know that these framework agreements include strategic initiatives, and they include as well the four business risk management programs, which these days are known as Agri-Invest, Agri-Stability, Agri-Insurance, and Agri-Recovery. And it's, these are fairly significant sums of money under the now expired Canadian Agriculture Partnership, which ran, for the 5 years from 2018 to 2023. The governments of Alberta and Canada together invested more than 400 million in the province's agriculture and agri-food sector over that 5-year period. And the successor one, the Sustainable Canadian Agriculture Partnership, which has just been signed this spring and will take effect over the next 5 years, will invest more than 508 million in the province over that time. Next slide, please. Now, the triple challenge facing food systems. So one of the speaking points, the possible speaking points for today is, what are the biggest challenges faced by the agricultural sector, and how do the responsibilities of federal and provincial governments affect these challenges? And so, preparing for this talk, I looked at these surveys that the Alberta government conducted. They're online with the agriculture sector in June 2021 and May, June 2022. And I noted that people who responded to the surveys identified as current and emerging challenges facing the sector the following: public trust, profitability and access to capital, access to labor, and environmental sustainability. And I've chosen not to focus on those, but to focus on this quote from the OECD, because I think it speaks to those challenges that are identified by the Alberta agriculture sector, but they also challenges that face agriculture more globally. And these are providing adequate, affordable, safe, and nutritious food for a growing global population. This is absolutely imperative, as we know. Providing livelihoods all along the food value chain, which is again imperative. And then thirdly, doing so while increasing the sustainability of the sector and its contribution to combating climate change. And I think it is this need to find a balance among these competing goals for agriculture that is not only increasingly apparent to international organizations like the OECD, but also to domestic governments, including those in Canada. Next slide, please. So I just want to speak then to the challenge that comes because of this complex relationship between agriculture and goals of food security, sustainable livelihoods and economic well-being in the agricultural sector, and environmental sustainability. And the complexity here, as I see it, is that agriculture is simultaneously, first, a contributor to the problem of climate change and environmental sustainability, owing to emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide from on-farm practices and land use changes. It is also, however, also a victim of climate change, as the economic livelihoods of farmers and others in the food value chain are put at risk by the increased frequency and intensity of storms, flooding, drought, and changes in precipitation patterns, not to mention forest fires. And then third, I think this is really important as well, is that agriculture is a potential part of the solution to climate change and environmental sustainability. And we see this happening with the adoption of on-farm management practices and land use changes that reduce greenhouse gases and provide environmental benefits. Next slide, please. Now, when we think about a sustainable agriculture strategy for Canada, I think there are clearly three challenges here that most people, I think, can agree on. And one, of course, the first challenge is weak incentives for producers owing to prospective trade-offs related to costs or production yields. Second, effective approaches will need to be tailored to the diverse agronomic and climatic conditions of farms across the country. And third, FPT governments, federal, provincial, territorial governments, must have the willingness and the capacity to work with one another and the agriculture sector to find those tailor-made approaches within flexible policies that the Department of Environment and Climate Change Canada has said are deemed necessary. So how are our governments and producers rising to these challenges? So next slide, please. So I'm going to focus here on the Sustainable Canadian Agriculture Partnership, which, as I say, has been signed and will be implemented over the next 5 years. And I think this is really a very clear example of the willingness of governments to collaborate here. Under it, I've just pulled some of the provisions of the agreement here and put on the slide. But under it, FPT governments have made tackling climate change and environmental protection to support GHG emissions reductions and the long-term vitality of the sector to be a priority area. They have signaled their agreement in principle, I'll emphasize, to a greenhouse gas emissions reduction target for agriculture of 3 to 5 megatons of CO2 per year. They've committed to review how business risk management programs can integrate climate risk and readiness goals. And they've embarked on a new cost share program, the Resilient Agriculture Landscapes Program, which is, of course, will be administered by the provinces and territories, and it will support carbon sequestration, adaptation, and environmental co-benefits for the ag sector. And last but not least, because they've been going on for some time, the FPT governments will continue to share the cost of environmental farm plans that are to get delivered by the provinces. And the intent here is encouragement for farmers to adopt beneficial management practices to promote conservation and environmental improvements. Next slide, please. And we know as well that the Government of Canada has also embarked on a consultation with agriculture groups around a sustainable agricultural strategy. This has been going on since December 2022, and the goal here is to get a consensus within among the agriculture groups about how to build on and adjust current environmental sustainability initiatives for the sector to support better environmental and climate outcomes. When it launched this consultative exercise, the Government of Canada also signaled that it intended to engage the provinces and territories on how to best work collaboratively towards development of the strategy. So it's not yet clear, at least not to me, how those two different consultations will be integrated, but presumably we will know that in the months ahead. Next slide, please. So finally, I just want to add a few words about supply management because I was asked to do so. It's something that I've followed for a long time. The kinds of pressures that are on supply management owing to a number of things, but including particularly international trade agreements and the joint roles of the Canadian federal and provincial governments here. And I emphasize here that this again is a case of sort of joint policy making. There are 3 pillars to supply management in the effort to regulate the domestic supply of poultry and dairy products to domestic demand. And these, of course, are the import controls at the border. They take the form of tariff rate quotas. They are set by the federal government. There are the production controls in the form of the national and provincial quotas that are negotiated and set by the agencies and boards delegated federal and provincial marketing powers, respectively. So again, that's a joint exercise there. And then third is the administered pricing, which is slightly different for the dairy sector and the poultry sector, insofar as the Federal Canadian Dairy Commission has a significant role in the dairy sector, while poultry prices are negotiated and set by provincial marketing boards. I think, there's abundant evidence that international trade agreements, the Canada-EU Comprehensive Trade Agreement, the renegotiable NAFTA, and then subsequently the renegotiated NAFTA known as CUSMA, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, they have definitely put pressure on import controls. Both federal and conservative, both conservative and Liberal federal governments made concessions to allow in more imports of dairy and poultry products as a part of those agreements. What the governments have done, again, it has been both federal, conservative, and Liberal governments, is to compensate supply managed producers for the lost market share under trade agreements. But the controversy, the pressures from the international arena continue. And as we know from in recent days, that the government of Canada is currently warding off challenges from trade partners, most recently New Zealand, but before that the US, trying to get the country to open up supply management to further foreign competition. And I think, my view is that these international pressures will remain, and that they do constitute a fairly significant threat to the continuing durability of supply management. So I'm going to leave my comments there, and thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your comments and questions in the question period.
Well, thank you so much, Grace. I think that was really fascinating to listen to, and I particularly really enjoyed your piece on climate change and kind of that three-pronged approach of it being kind of a contributor, but also a victim of climate change, and then also a piece of the solution. I thought that was really interesting. We're going to move to our next poll question. Our next poll question for you: do you feel the federal government approach to agricultural issues considers regionality in its decision-making? And your answers are yes, no, or it does, but it could be better. I'll also remind you, maybe take a time right now to submit your questions if you have any for Grace. We certainly would welcome any questions you have that we will answer here at the end of the presentation. But while they're fresh in mind, take a moment to put your questions in the Q&A box. And we'll just give a couple more moments for folks to finish their voting, and then we will read the results. And it looks like, to the question, do you feel the federal government approach to agricultural issues does not consider regionality in decision-making? 16% of you said yes, 29% of you said no, and 55% of you said it does, but it could be better. All right, we're now going to hand it over to Connie Phillips from Alberta Beekeepers. So take it away, Connie.
All right, let me see if I can get this organized. I had a lesson. Can everybody, whoop, that's the wrong screen, right? Is it?
Yeah, you'll just need to go into presenter mode now.
Okay. Oops, I'm not having any luck here.
Connie, I can share your screens for you.
Wait, is that working now?
Yeah, so we're just seeing your presenter mode. So if you click on the display settings piece, you can you'll have an option to switch displays, and then it'll give everyone the full screen view. Yeah, just up at the top where it says display settings. Yeah, and that should say swap, presenter view, and slideshow. Yep, there you go.
All right, thank you very much. All right, thank you, Grace. That was very interesting. And thank you, Simpson School, for inviting me to present today. I'd like to start with a little bit of background about beekeeping in Alberta, and from Grace's presentation this morning, I want to bring this right down to the ground from the perspective of beekeepers in the province. And just a little background on the commission. It's been in existence since 1933, The commission itself was formed in 2006 by orders of council and became a commission as part of the Agricultural Marketing Board or Marketing Council, and is governed by Marketing Council by both regulations and bylaws. So we deal with several different layers of regulations and policy setting. A little bit of background about me. I did work for the provincial government for about 28 years, not exclusively, but primarily in the agriculture ministry. And my background is in science, did a lot of product development and worked in the research area for most of my career. And I've been with the commission for about 5.5 years now. One of the first things I think that's for the commission itself and myself is this whole area of policy development, and looking externally outward to develop policy is a relatively new undertaking for the commission. So we've had to start from scratch. And as I was thinking about my presentation for this session today, and thinking about how the commission would set policy, it really occurred to me that it rolled out of resolutions that were presented at the AGM, and that the resolutions were how the commission was setting policy and it was a way for the producers to let the commission board know the areas of priority that the producers felt the commission should be acting on. And so the success of acting on those different resolutions and seeing them through to completion was relatively varied depending on who was on the board at any given time, at their ability to carry out and respond to those requests. And also time, because everybody's producers, and for about 10 months out of the year, they're out farming or producing honey and growing bees. One of the other challenges I saw when I started working for the commission is outside of the commission, there wasn't a lot of understanding or familiarity with the industry, even within the Ministry of Agriculture. And so that in and of itself presented some obstacles into understanding what was needed by the industry in regard to different policies, and how policies that were being set for perhaps larger industries could negatively impact smaller industries, such as beekeeping. And one of the most interesting one is both federally and provincially, or at least I think it's interesting, is honeybees are lumped in with crops, which I find intriguing because really honeybees are livestock. So being lumped in with crops is, you can kind of see why there'd be a relationship there, but then policies that are set for crops don't often fit for policies that need to be set for beekeeping or affect livestock. And so that's been an interesting dichotomy, and one we still kind of struggle with, but are getting better at. And I think the other important aspect, and Grace's slide about climate change, honeybees touch every aspect of agriculture. They contribute to food and feed production. They are an ecosystem service, and they are also a sentinel for One Health, which I find intriguing. I don't know that they contribute in the honeybee industry itself contributes in a significant way to greenhouse gas emissions. And perhaps maybe the most direct way would be when beekeepers are driving around to check on their bees, but otherwise it's pretty nominal. So some of the other concerns we have as policy gets set for climate change is you can develop new best management practices that might be good for cattle and they might be good for crops, but they often are not going to be good for bees. And so because bees, it's a tiny industry and still not often thought of as those policies are being set at a higher level, they kind of get lost in the conversation. So one of our biggest jobs as a commission is to keep reminding politicians at both levels of the importance of considering the beekeeping industry as new policies get set and new benchmarks are made. Let me just move on here. The commission and policy, as I said earlier, it's a relatively new activity, and looking outward as policy is considered and developed for the commission is still it's a new activity. And for me, myself, wasn't very involved in policy development on a formal level when I did work for government, and some of the bigger impacts of policy development on the industry have been a steep learning curve for me, and one that's not perhaps thought of here, but is critically important, are all the policies that get set at the federal level around labor. And there's 5 different ministries that consider policy or have mandates to consider labor and policy around labor as it applies to temporary foreign workers and seasonal workers as they come into the province. And those ministries, where it gets complex for us as a tiny industry, is those 5 ministries at a federal level often are talking to each other or working with each other as they develop policy for seasonal workers and temporary foreign workers. And where that became glaringly apparent was during COVID, when it was incredibly challenging to even just get workers here. And new policies were being set, new inspection requirements were being set. And touching on the point about regionality, and I'll get into that a little bit later, but often I feel the regionality piece is really weak now. I think it used to be great when the federal government had more representation out across the country. But often in regard to labor, policies are set based on what people are seeing or hearing in Eastern Canada, and there's some serious issues there. But those same issues that are happening in Ontario related to seasonal workers are not happening here in Alberta, and are definitely not happening within the beekeeping industry. The commission had gone about setting policy, as I said, by developing resolutions. Those resolutions would often stay within the commission, or they would get sent to the national bee organization, the Canadian Honey Council, and the Honey Council itself would make a decision about whether or not to carry those forward. So often something that might be really important to the commission wouldn't go beyond the Honey Council board. Until the fall of 2017, the commission's board was operational, and I think this transition is really important. So they did, until 2017, often struggle with setting policy and making sure that policy got out to where it needed to be. And because of there's a bit of a tension between the national organization and the Alberta Beekeeper Commission. At times, the commission now will step around the national organization and go directly to the federal government. And we found that to be much more effective in the commission's ability to be heard by the federal government over those issues that are very important to the long-term sustainability of the Alberta beekeeping industry. The commission policy and producers' needs and or regulatory impact often straddle both provincial and federal governments. And this is, I think an example of this would be around food safety regulations, which changed in 2019. And for any beekeeper who produces honey and wants to market outside the province, they have to now be licensed by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. And there's nothing wrong with that. That helps maintain markets. But the introduction of that, who's actually monitoring and overseeing that, is confusing and complicated. The other place where there's a great deal of overlap is the regulations are set in regard to temporary foreign workers, seasonal worker housing, but it's enforced by the Alberta government. And Alberta does have one of the, which is a good thing, Alberta does have one of the strictest occupational health and safety and labor laws across the country. So these types of things, and just this list of different ministries that the commission has to deal with in regard to labor, transportation, jobs, economy and trade, economic development through Prairies Can, environment, forestry, infrastructure. We have rules we have to follow when we put bees out onto Crown land. We have rules that have to be followed And those are different rules than the rules that have to be followed when bees are put on somebody's private property or crop producer. So it's just as we're trying to find our way through these different jurisdictional labyrinths, it can be very challenging and at times overwhelming. For the Commission and setting policy, we have narrowed our priorities down to, and our top challenges going forward are bee health, labor, stock replacement, and maintaining markets. And there's a number of factors that enter into both these. At a high level, I'll just start with bee health. The health of bee is declining globally. We see, due to the decline in bee health, we're losing honey production, but as bee health declines, also that affects crop production. And so, and that affects food production for people and for animals. And we have to keep all of those things in mind. Labor becomes more and more challenging. From a distance, sometimes it feels like the federal government makes rules without really understanding what's going out in this part of the country, and things like every bedroom needs this, and workers need to have the following, and everybody needs to have their own bedroom, and some of those things just don't make sense. So as far as housing goes, and often it's done without a consultation. So it's like and then the results of what the federal government has decided as appropriate for labor and labor housing gets presented to the industry at a later date. Stock replacement is key. With bee health declining, overwintering losses are increasing, and the ability to have enough high quality bee stock on an annual basis is a critical issue. Maintaining markets is becoming a critical issue. And I've seen, even in the short time that I've been with the Commission, that there's a decline in the amount of honey that's produced in the country, and there's a shift in the amount of honey that's being imported. So there's pressures on honey producers to maintain markets both domestically and internationally. So, and I think one of the biggest things in maintaining markets, and this is starting to impact the honey production industry in a bigger way, are things like the UN sustainability goals. But one of the biggest factors affecting honey production is our concerns around adulteration. So in Commission and government relationships, we find what the challenges are as a small commission and new to building these relationships outside of the Commission and outside of the province. Within governments, different ministries often do not work well together or communicate effectively. So we could let different ministries or a ministry know about an issue or a policy desire of the Commission, and that doesn't get communicated anywhere else. And as I gave the example earlier of labor, there are 5 federal ministries who have mandates that include temporary foreign workers and seasonal workers. That gets very challenging to figure out, depending on what it is, who you need to be talking to get something sorted out. In some cases, these same ministries will delegate to provincial bodies to carry out the regulatory role, and sometimes that's a surprise, and sometimes they'll let you know that it's the responsibility. But it's been a steep learning curve for all of us within the beekeeping industry. Another example of that is transportation regulations are federally mandated. However, they've been delegated to the provinces to enforce, and all the provinces are enforcing these regulations to a different degree. And the example would be electronic service logs, which came into force just this last summer. And this is a big impact on moving bees around the country. As you cross provincial borders, the rules are applied differently. But also we have found, and this is where bees considered as livestock, you don't want to stop on the side of the road with a load of bees. They'll escape. It's a human safety risk. And if we have days like we've had over the last month or so where it's hot, the bees will die. And so it's hard to, as a tiny little industry, to communicate those concerns and the desire for an amended policy to the Federal Transportation Ministry. Regionality, I feel, in our conversations with the federal government about stock replacement, they want everything to be the same and every province to agree. On the topic of stock replacement, the needs are very different across the country, and so that need for consensus or differences across the country, we feel needs to be addressed. And so not having strong regional representation by the bee industry at the federal level, we feel is detrimental. And I guess an observation of mine after about 5.5 years of doing this, it's not that you can't speak with the people in the federal government, but it's like you need a presence in Ottawa to have your presence be felt. The Commission and government relationships, again, I feel like the Commission has a great relationship with Alberta Agriculture, and Alberta Agriculture has done a good job of representing the Alberta beekeeping industry at the FPT table. And the FPT table has been a great spot to bring those issues forward and allow the provinces to have that conversation about their different concerns and where the differences are across the country. Alberta MPs have enabled Alberta beekeepers to represent the province and its concerns at the recent Senate Standing Committee hearing on bee mortality. And so that's been fantastic. And so we are starting to find our way into this kind of federal, provincial, regulatory policy area a little bit more consistently. But I also feel like for an industry like ours, that's quite small and not well seen yet, that relationships matter. And so the building of relationships with other organizations and in other jurisdictions are key to being heard and having some of these policies move forward. So the Commission has invested significant time and energy over the past 5+ years or so to advocate, educate, and build relationships at both levels of government. We also feel that partnerships are key. And we were and are grateful that we were invited to join the Team Alberta Crops group. We also are participating in projects where it doesn't seem like there'd be an obvious fit, such as living labs, but that gives us a venue to voice those concerns about, well, as you're setting the new best management practices, consider the bees that are out on your land at the same time that you're doing that. And it also gives us another platform to talk about why bees matter and the contributions they do make to the environment. And vicariously, when they're out there on the same land where the cattle are grazing or the crops are growing, they're benefiting those industries as well. And coaching and mentorship has been quite important to us as we are on this journey to getting better at policy development and building those relationships.
Well, thank you so much, Connie. That was an excellent presentation, and I found that really fascinating, the whole conversation around how do you establish a presence in Ottawa and how do you actually get your voice heard at a policy table. So that was absolutely fascinating. We have one more poll question, and then we're going to jump into Q&A. So reminder, if you're done answering the poll question, you can ask a question to either Grace or to Connie, but our poll question is, do you think the current federal and provincial collaborative relationship is hindering the agricultural sector? And your answer is yes or no. So we'll give you a minute or so to go through and answer this. But reminder, if you've done so already, please put any questions you may have in the Q&A box, and we'll get to those here shortly. All right, we'll give you one last moment to finish answering here, and then we are going to read the results. Perfect. So 39% of you said yes, you do think the current federal and provincial collaborative relationship is hindering the agricultural sector, and 61% of you said no. So we're now going to jump into the Q&A section. As a reminder, if you see a question that you really like, you can hit the thumbs up underneath it as well to make sure that it gets seen first. But we'll jump into our first question, and this one came in mid-presentation for you, Grace, so I'll ask it to you. This person is curious how you feel banks and financial institutions can work with FPT levels of government to support Canadian ag businesses and farms.
Well, we know that the banks and financial institutions are a major lending institution. So I'm not exactly sure. Is it possible to have that question a little bit more specific? Can work with federal, provincial, territorial governments to support Canadian ag business farms. Yeah, whoever asked it, can you elaborate a bit? Because we know that, we do have the Farm Credit Corporation. We do know that banks lend to farmers. Are we talking here about more favorable terms? Are we talking about, yeah, I think I would need to know a little bit more about what's being asked here.
Sure, yeah, we'll maybe ask them to kind of do a follow-up for their question. This next question, which I'm going to pose to both of you, so maybe Grace, you can jump in on that one. You're curious how FPT policies are approaching supporting new entrants into the ag sector.
Yeah, probably not enough. I mean, we do know that we have an aging farming population that's pretty expensive to get into agriculture. Yeah, there probably ought to be more initiatives here. I don't really know what Alberta is doing here. I know that Quebec this is an issue in Quebec, and that they are trying their best to, I think, come up with some kind of incentives to get farmers into agriculture. But yeah, I'm sorry, I really don't know what's going on here. But maybe whoever asked the question knows, because I just would say that there's not enough being done, because it's just too expensive a proposition to get into agriculture these days, I think, for most people.
Absolutely. And maybe let's boil down to the granular level. Connie, how do you see this impacting Alberta beekeepers, and what kind of policies are encouraging them?
A little bit different, I would say, again, from sort of a high level thought that, and I agree that the agriculture industry is aging. Beekeepers actually are a fairly young group on the whole, younger than the rest of the industry together. So that's not as much of an issue, and I think it's considerably less expensive to get started in beekeeping than it is in some of the other sectors. But there are, through different financial institutions such as AFSC, there's lending programs to help beekeepers get started as they grow, and there's different incentives through some of the business risk management programs such as Agri-Invest, which can also help them stabilize. We've had really good support from AFSC in Alberta in changing some of their programs to reflect the beekeeping industry a little bit better. So that's been quite beneficial and helpful to our producers. So prior to about a year and a half ago, there was a significant slide in beekeepers who were participating in business risk management programs. And that's turning around again and going back up as the programs have become more appropriate for beekeepers.
Perfect. Thank you. Our next question, which is also to both of you. Why is there no provincial/federal agricultural policy and support to transition towards a more plant-based food system, given the highly detrimental impacts of animal agriculture on GHG emissions, land use, the environment, water health, zoonotic viruses, etc.? And Grace, maybe we'll start with you, because this is quite a broad question. Yeah.
Right. So, what I would say is that my understanding of the business risk management programs is that they don't privilege livestock growing over planted crops, right? Crops and oilseeds, they don't do that, right? There is also, I think it's also not entirely fair to equate the practices that go on, say, in other countries when it comes to destroying rainforests in order to encourage cattle production. I think it's important to take a look at what Canadian farmers are doing, including Canadian cattle farmers, when it comes to best practices around mitigating, greenhouse gases, around land use management. I know there are technological developments around feed. I read about them, don't practice them, but I read about technological developments around animal feed that are, designed to try to produce, fewer greenhouse gas emissions, that sort of thing. So, protein is a really important source of most people's diet. I mean, the FAO has also pointed this out, that people do need good high nutrient protein, right? And so I think that I'm not going to condemn the livestock industry flat out. I mean, I grew up on a cow-calf farm. My father, the cattle grazed on the land. The manure was plowed right back into the soil. In those days, people were cultivating. It wasn't zero risk tillage in those days, low tillage. And so I'm not going to condemn the livestock sector. I think that what we need to be doing here is giving strong financial incentives for farmers to be able to adopt the practices that science is telling us are going to help us reduce greenhouse gas emissions and make for a more sustainable agriculture. What goes on in other countries, we don't have much control over, notwithstanding, international goals around things. But what we can do, I think, is try to encourage people at home to engage in more sustainable practice. And that's going to require government policy. I don't think we can, what we need to do is to help farmers make this transition, because it is costly, and a lot of farmers just work with very small margins, right? And we have to make sure that they can still make a living when they're, when they're transitioning to more sustainable practices.
Yeah, Connie, I think I'm going to broaden this question a little bit, because obviously this is a little bit out of scope for you, but talking about this in terms of sustainability, which I think you put excellently, Grace. Yeah, what steps are needed to be taken by governments in order to promote sustainable agriculture? And specifically, what government actions are you looking for in the beekeeping space?
Oh, wow. And I was all ready to answer the other question.
Oh, well, you're more than welcome to do that as well. Yeah.
Well, just on, I'll try and do both, but just on the, Grace, I loved your answer to the question. I thought it was really considered and balanced. And I guess as far as support, financial support of contributing to more plant-based foods, just in my background, when I started working with the government, I worked in a food product process development facility in Leduc, Alberta. And there were, 28 years ago, there was a lot of funding that was put towards supporting the development of plant-based foods. But where you bump into issues is you can't force people to eat something they don't want to eat. And so we have all that stuff out there, but it's up to the market to buy it. And then I guess I'll just go a little bit further than maybe Grace did with not condemning cattle, and just say, I think if you would to compare life cycle assessments of raising animals the way that it's done here out on the prairies, or producing plant-based foods, you might start to find equivalencies in greenhouse gas emissions by the time you bring the plant-based food, bring the grain to the facility, you harvest it and you do all that. You start running into some of those same things. So I think going to the sustainability piece, it needs to be considered at all levels of production, and not just at the very end of the food production system. It needs to be considered from the point of driving the food from Mexico to our grocery stores, or what we grow on the fields here, and then transport most of it into the United States and then back. So all of that needs to be thought about, and not just one segment of the agriculture industry be held accountable for greenhouse gas emissions, my opinion. As far as sustainability from a beekeeping point of view, there's a number of factors that are affecting the sustainability of the industry, but removing those would have a detrimental impact, say, on crop production. And so what I think we have to do is find that middle ground of well, if we can reduce pesticide, herbicide use, but find herbicides that still benefit the crop industry and don't hurt bees, then that's a good thing. I think that we tend to, as humans, we tend to find that one single answer that's going to be the gold nugget, and if we do that, it'll fix everything. Where generally there needs to be a range of activities going on to, if you want to make a step change. I'd say, having worked in government and tried to bring some of these step changes about while in government, governments tend to have a short attention span. And so we need to find a way to have a longer attention span, more sustainable funding, to create that continuity, to achieve the change that's desired. And if you're not seeing it in a 2-year window, it doesn't mean it's not starting to happen. It just means some of these things are going to take a while to affect a significant change.
So we have time for one last question. And the question here, I'm going to change a little bit from what was submitted by the audience, but I'll give a little context to what was submitted. So they asked, with the county of Stettler declaring an agricultural disaster, what does the provincial and federal government do with this declaration? I did open up the article and it looks like they've declared it over drought. But Grace, I'd like you to maybe broaden this question a little bit and ask you, what's the role of municipal governance, and specifically rural municipal governments, in working with the provincial and federal government to kind of uphold and maintain the agricultural sector?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question about the role of municipal governments, because it's, I focused on federal, provincial, and not on municipal governments. So my simple answer is that would be around land use planning, I imagine. But and I don't, that's just a guess because I don't really know. I've not studied it. But I do think, we do have the Agri Recovery Program, right? That's part of the business risk management portfolio. So that's there. That program will kick in the event of a disaster. But there is also always, as well as we know, the opportunity for, Alberta went to the government of Canada around the forest fires, right? So there's also there's extra opportunity to go there and ask for additional money. But what we do have, I think that's the whole point of the business risk management portfolio, was to be able to have programs here that farmers can sign up for and be able to get some kind of of compensation when you do have these disasters, these droughts. And I know there's a debate going around about how they do need to probably be modified and reformed, because we're going to have more and more of these situations where you've got droughts and floods and forest fires. This is how climate change manifests itself. So, if municipal governments are doing their job, they should be pressing the provincial governments, and they should be to take some action here, because ultimately municipal governments are creatures of the province and not creatures of Ottawa. So that would be my answer to this. So I'm sorry, it's vague. It's just in general terms, but
that's completely okay. Connie, maybe I'll open it up to you for any comments or final thoughts before we wrap up here.
Well, I think that by having the municipality declare a state of emergency or a disaster, it triggers a number of things that go on in the provincial government that can support the municipality. But yeah, with Grace, it's like the relationship between, I agree with Grace, the relationship between the municipalities and the province are important ones, and the municipalities all answer to the provincial government in one way or another. So I would expect that the provincial government to respond. I think this happened a couple of years ago with that drought, then, where several municipalities were declaring states of disaster, and then it allows the different industries within there to get different types of supports from the provincial government.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Grace, and thank you so much, Connie. These presentations today were excellent. I learned a lot, and I certainly hope the audience did as well. We'd like to thank the audience as well for taking their time out of their day to attend today's webinar. We certainly hope you've enjoyed it, and please let us know your feedback by filling out the questionnaire that's going to be emailed to you later this week. But with that, we wish you a good rest of your day, and have a good